There is something in your hand right now, or close enough to it. A ring on a finger. A chain at a throat. A coin in a pocket or a clasp on a watch. Something small, something warm to the touch, something that catches light in a way no other material quite manages. You may have worn it so long you no longer notice it. But the object itself remembers. It remembers a river in ancient Lydia where a king's touch supposedly turned everything to gold. It remembers the hands of Egyptian craftsmen pressing thin sheets of it onto the faces of gods. It remembers the holds of Spanish galleons and the tunnels of South African mines and the firelit workshops of jewelers in cities that no longer exist. Gold does not rust. Gold does not tarnish. Bury it for 3,000 years and pull it from the earth and it will look exactly as it did the day it was buried. That is not a metaphor. That is chemistry. And it is one of the reasons that, across every continent and every century, humans have looked at this soft yellow metal and decided that it was different. That it was special. That it was, somehow, sacred. The history of gold is not simply the history of money. It is the history of desire itself. It is the story of what humans reach for when they want to signal permanence, power, devotion, or divinity. It runs through the oldest tombs on earth and through the vaults of modern central banks. It connects a Nubian queen buried with golden ornaments 4,000 years ago to the circuit boards of computers assembled last year. The same metal. The same gleam. What follows is not a list of dates and dynasties. It is something closer to a long, slow journey through mines and markets, through temples and treasuries, through wars fought over it and loves declared with it. Some of what you will hear will confirm what you already suspected. Some of it will quietly change the way you think about a word you use every day: valuable. Get comfortable. Let's begin. Gold is one of the few elements on Earth that exists in its pure form in nature. Most metals are locked inside ores, bonded to other minerals, requiring smelting and chemistry to extract. Gold simply lies there, in riverbeds, in rock veins, sometimes in nuggets large enough to hold in a palm. This is not a small thing. It means that the very first humans to encounter gold did not need to be metallurgists or engineers. They only needed eyes. A child could find it. A wanderer could pick it up. And because it required no transformation to be beautiful, it entered the human imagination at a stage of history so early that the exact moment is lost entirely. The oldest worked gold objects ever found date to roughly 4,600 BCE, discovered in a burial site called the Varna necropolis in what is now Bulgaria. But the people who made those objects had clearly been working with gold for a long time before that. The skill is too refined, too assured, to be the work of beginners. Gold and human consciousness became acquainted somewhere in a deep, unnamed past, and they have never been separated since. The Varna necropolis in Bulgaria, where some of the oldest worked gold in the world was found, tells a story that goes far beyond jewelry. The site was a cemetery. And the gold was not distributed equally among the dead. Some graves contained almost no gold at all. Others were extraordinarily rich. One single burial contained more gold than had been found in all other prehistoric sites in the world combined up to that point. What this tells archaeologists is not just that these people valued gold. It tells them that these people had social hierarchy. That some individuals accumulated wealth and status in life that followed them into death. Gold, even in its earliest known appearances, was not merely decorative. It was a marker of power. A signal to the living and the dead alike about who mattered and who did not. The gleam of those 5,000-year-old ornaments is still beautiful today. But what they actually represent is something older and harder than beauty. Ancient Egyptians called gold the flesh of the gods. Specifically, they associated it with Ra, the sun god, whose body was believed to be made of gold and whose bones were believed to be silver. This was not poetry. It was theology. Gold did not merely represent the divine, it was understood to be a physical manifestation of divine substance. This belief had enormous practical consequences. Gold was used to cover the faces of royal mummies, to sheathe the inner chambers of temples, to craft the statues that stood in the most sacred rooms, rooms that no ordinary person would ever enter. The intention was literal, to surround the divine with the divine. To create spaces where the material world and the world of the gods were made of the same substance. The golden funeral mask of Tutankhamun, now one of the most recognized objects in human history, is not a portrait. It is a transformation, a young king becoming, in death, the thing he was always believed to be. Imperishable. Solar. Made of light that never fades. The word gold itself is ancient. In Old English it was gold. In Proto-Germanic it was gul. Trace it far enough back and you reach a Proto-Indo-European root that simply meant yellow or to shine. Across dozens of languages separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, the name for this metal keeps returning to light. To glow. To the quality of catching the sun. The Latin word for gold was aurum, which is why the chemical symbol on the periodic table is O. Aurum likely traces back to a word meaning sunrise, or the dawn. In Sanskrit the word was jval, meaning to shine. In Hebrew, zahav, connected to brilliance. Humans named this metal the same way across cultures that never met, they named it after what it did to light. Not after where it was found or what it was used for, but after the simple, irreducible fact of its radiance. A metal named for shine, worshipped for its resemblance to the sun, buried with the dead as a passport to eternity. For most of ancient history, gold was not primarily money. It was something closer to the physical body of sacred power. The shift, the moment when gold became currency in a formal, standardized sense, happened in a small kingdom in western Anatolia called Lydia, sometime around 600 BCE. The Lydians, under a dynasty of kings, began minting coins of a naturally occurring gold-silver alloy called electrum, stamped with official symbols that guaranteed their weight and purity. This was not the first time metal had been used in trade. But it was the first time metal was shaped into standardized, government-issued tokens of exchange. The implications were enormous. Before coinage, trade required negotiation over the weight and quality of metal every single time. With coins, the state vouched for the value. Commerce could accelerate. Markets could expand. The anonymous transaction between strangers who had never met and would never meet became possible. The world that followed, the world of money as we understand it, begins in Lydia, in a small workshop, with a die pressed into a lump of pale gold. The legendary King Croesus of Lydia, whose name became synonymous with wealth in the ancient world, was the first ruler known to issue pure gold coins, as distinct from the electrum coins of his predecessors. The phrase rich as Croesus echoed through Greek, Roman, and medieval European culture for over 2,000 years. But Croesus himself ended badly. He attacked Persia, believing a Delphic oracle's prophecy that if he crossed a river he would destroy a great empire. He crossed the river Halys. He was defeated, captured, and Lydia was absorbed into the Persian Empire. The great empire the oracle had predicted would fall was his own. Croesus reportedly spent his final years as an advisor to the Persian king Cyrus the Great, a man who now owned Croesus's gold. The inventor of the gold standard, conquered. His name survived as a symbol of wealth long after everything he built had vanished. The ancient Egyptians were not simply collectors of gold. They were its largest producers in the ancient world. The gold came primarily from Nubia, a region south of Egypt that was so defined by its gold deposits that the Egyptian word for it was likely derived from their word for gold itself. Egyptian control of Nubian gold mines was maintained through centuries of military occupation, forced labor, and administrative infrastructure that stretched hundreds of miles into inhospitable desert. The scale was extraordinary. One papyrus from around 1160 BCE is essentially a map of the gold mining region in the Eastern Desert, the oldest known geological map in human history. It shows roads, mountains, gold-bearing rock formations, workers' settlements, and a temple. The Egyptians were not wandering into the desert to pick up nuggets. They were running an industrial operation, and they understood their geology with precision. The golden faces of their gods were built on a foundation of organized suffering that the gods themselves never acknowledged. Roman soldiers returning from campaigns in the east brought back gold in quantities that had never before entered the Italian peninsula. The effects were not entirely positive. The sudden influx of gold into the Roman economy during the Republic's expansion destabilized prices, concentrated wealth, and began a process that historians would later identify as one of the slow structural causes of the Republic's decline. Gold, in large enough quantities, does not simply make a society richer. It reshapes it. It accelerates inequality. It makes certain men so powerful that the old rules can no longer contain them. Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul brought back enormous quantities of gold, enough, according to ancient sources, to depress the price of gold across the entire Mediterranean for years. He used that wealth to fund a political machine, an army loyal to him personally, and eventually a civil war. The gold of Gaul did not just fill Roman treasuries. It ended the Roman Republic. The Byzantine Empire, successor to Rome in the East, maintained a gold coin called the solidus for over 700 years without significant debasement. 700 years of monetary stability, in a world of constant war, plague, and political upheaval. The solidus was so reliable that it became the international reserve currency of the medieval world. Merchants from Arabia, Persia, Russia, and Scandinavia all accepted it. Its image, typically a Byzantine emperor on one side, Christ on the other, circulated from the British Isles to the borders of China. The word soldier may derive from solidus, men fought for pay, and pay meant gold coins. When the Byzantine economy finally began to weaken and the solidus was debased in the 11th century, the effects rippled across the entire known world. The most stable money in history had lasted longer than most empires, and its decline was felt in markets as far away as the Baltic Sea. Medieval European alchemists spent centuries attempting to transmute base metals, lead, copper, iron, into gold. This is usually remembered as a failed pseudoscience, a collective delusion of the pre-modern mind. But the alchemical tradition was also the direct ancestor of modern chemistry. The equipment, the methods, the vocabulary, the concept of systematic experimentation, all of it flowed from alchemical workshops into the laboratories of the scientific revolution. Men like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton were serious students of alchemy. Newton spent more time on alchemical research than he did on physics. His unpublished alchemical manuscripts fill hundreds of pages. The dream of making gold out of lead was never realized. But in the long, strange attempt to realize it, Europeans invented distillation, identified acids and bases, developed laboratory glassware, and built the conceptual framework that eventually became the periodic table. The search for gold, even when it failed, produced something valuable. The gold rushes of the 19th century are remembered as wild, chaotic explosions of fortune-seeking. What is less remembered is how precisely they transformed entire continents. The California gold rush of 1848 did not merely attract prospectors. It triggered the fastest mass migration in American history to that point, created the financial infrastructure of the American West, accelerated California's statehood by years, and effectively ended the way of life of dozens of indigenous nations within a single decade. San Francisco went from a village of a few hundred people to a city of 30,000 in under 2 years. The port, the banks, the hotels, the newspapers, all of it appeared with a speed that seemed impossible. Gold does not just create wealth. It creates cities, routes, institutions, and catastrophes simultaneously, and the catastrophes are usually distributed among people who never found a single flake. The gold discovered in California in 1848 was found by a man who was trying to keep it secret. James Marshall, a carpenter working for John Sutter at a sawmill on the American River, spotted gold flakes in the water on January 24. Sutter swore his workers to secrecy and tried to acquire the land rights before word spread. He failed. Within weeks, workers were abandoning the mill. Within months, the secret was out and the rush had begun. Sutter himself was ruined. His land was overrun by squatters, his cattle were stolen, his crops were trampled, and his employees deserted him. He spent the rest of his life petitioning the U.S. government for compensation and died in a Washington, D.C. boarding house, still waiting. Marshall, who found the gold, died penniless. The men who became wealthy in the California gold rush were largely not the miners. They were the merchants who sold supplies to the miners, the men who sold shovels, boots, tents, and denim trousers. One of those merchants was a man named Levi Strauss. The concept of a gold standard, the idea that a nation's paper currency should be directly backed by and convertible into gold, was not an ancient practice. It was a 19th century invention that spread rapidly and then collapsed with equal speed. Britain formally adopted the gold standard in 1821. The United States followed in 1873. By the early 20th century, most of the major economies of the world had tied their currencies to gold. By 1971, none of them had. The end came in stages, first the pressures of World War I, then the Great Depression, then the Bretton Woods negotiations after World War II, and finally Richard Nixon's decision in 1971 to sever the last link between the US dollar and gold entirely. The gold standard lasted, in its full international form, for less than 50 years. But the idea that gold is the only real money, the only true store of value, has outlasted every policy change and continues to shape economic arguments to this day. South Africa became the world's dominant gold producer after the discovery of the Witwatersrand Reef in 1886, a deposit so vast it would eventually yield roughly half of all the gold ever mined in human history. The mines that developed there were unlike anything previously attempted. The ore was not rich. Extracting gold from it required crushing enormous quantities of rock and treating it with cyanide solution. The labor was provided largely by black South African men under a system of contract labor that was coercive, dangerous, and deliberately designed to prevent workers from accumulating wealth or property. The gold of South Africa built one of the most sophisticated financial and industrial economies in the Southern Hemisphere. It also built, and was used to justify, one of the most systematically brutal racial regimes of the 20th century. The Witwatersrand Reef runs for miles beneath the city of Johannesburg. The city stands on top of the gold. The gold is still there. The phrase "not all that glitters is gold" predates Shakespeare, though Shakespeare made it famous. The version in The Merchant of Venice reads "all that glisters is not gold," glisters being the original form. But variations on the same warning appear in Latin, in medieval French poetry, and in texts going back centuries before Shakespeare. The warning was necessary because the problem was real. Pyrite iron sulfide, known as fool's gold, deceives with extraordinary effectiveness in low light or when viewed by an inexperienced eye. It has the yellow color, the metallic luster, and even approximately the density that a casual observer might associate with gold. Prospectors lost fortunes, expeditions were ruined, and entire investment schemes collapsed because of pyrite. The phrase endured not merely as a poetic observation but as practical advice for a world in which distinguishing real gold from convincing imitations was a matter of financial survival. Ancient goldsmiths developed a remarkably sophisticated method for testing the purity of gold called the touchstone test. A piece of black lyddite or similar dark stone was used as a surface. The gold in question was rubbed across the stone, leaving a streak. The color and character of the streak, its shade of yellow, its width, its texture, told an experienced assayer a great deal about the gold's purity and alloy composition. The method was accurate enough that it remained in professional use for over 2,000 years. The touchstone also entered language as a metaphor for any ultimate test or standard of quality. When something is described as the touchstone of excellence, the phrase traces back to a dark flat stone in an ancient workshop, and a craftsman bending close in poor light to read the color of a streak left by a piece of metal he had not yet decided to trust. The Aztec civilization that Hernán Cortés encountered in 1519 had a relationship with gold fundamentally different from the European one. For the Aztecs, gold was not money. They had no monetary economy in the European sense. Gold was sacred material associated with the sun, used in ritual objects, worn by rulers and priests in ceremonial contexts. When Cortés and his soldiers saw the Aztec treasures, they immediately calculated their monetary value in Spanish terms. The Aztecs could not initially understand why the Spanish were so specifically and desperately focused on the gold rather than on the jade, the featherwork, or the turquoise, which the Aztecs considered more valuable. The encounter was not merely a clash of armies. It was a collision between two entirely different systems of meaning, in which the same yellow metal represented entirely different things. Cortés won militarily. His understanding of value gold as money remade the world. The Aztec understanding of gold as sacred substance exists now only in fragments and museum cases. The Spanish extraction of gold and silver from the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries was so large and so rapid that it triggered a century-long inflation across Europe known as the Price Revolution. The quantity of precious metal in European circulation roughly tripled between 1500 and 1650. Prices rose across the continent, not uniformly, not predictably, but persistently. Wages did not rise at the same rate. The effect was a massive transfer of wealth from wage earners and fixed-income landlords to merchants and entrepreneurs. The social order of medieval Europe had been based on stable hierarchies of land and obligation. The price revolution destabilized those hierarchies and contributed, indirectly, to the social and political upheavals of the 17th century, peasant revolts, religious wars, the collapse of old aristocracies, the rise of commercial classes. The gold of the Americas did not make Europe richer in any simple sense. It remade Europe, painfully and permanently, into something else. In medieval and early modern Europe, the control of gold supply was inseparable from warfare. Wars required soldiers. Soldiers required pay. Pay required metal. A kingdom that ran out of gold could not sustain an army long enough to win. This created a feedback loop. Successful wars brought gold, which funded more wars. Unsuccessful wars depleted treasuries, leading to the debasing of coinage, the betrayal of mercenary contracts, and military collapse. The history of medieval European warfare is in many respects the history of who controlled enough gold to keep men in the field. Edward III of England nearly bankrupted himself financing the 100 Years' War, defaulting on loans from Florentine banking families in the 1340s in a financial collapse that helped trigger a banking crisis across Europe. The relationship between gold and violence was not incidental. It was structural. Gold was the blood of medieval warfare, and when it stopped flowing, armies died. The island of Hispaniola, where Columbus first landed in 1492, was greeted with stories of gold, and Columbus pursued those stories with obsessive urgency. The gold he brought back to Spain was real but modest. The story he told, that vast gold fields lay inland, just beyond the next range of hills, was exaggerated to the point of fabrication. But the fabrication worked. It secured funding for subsequent voyages. It launched the colonization of the Caribbean. The gold that actually arrived in Spain from the Americas in the early decades after Columbus was relatively small. The enormous flood came later, from Mexico and Peru, from mines worked by compelled indigenous labor under brutal conditions. Columbus never found the gold fields he promised. But his promise of gold was real enough as a political instrument that it set in motion events that would kill millions and transform the planet. The actual gold mattered less, in the short run, than the idea of it. Gold has been found on every continent on Earth, including Antarctica, though the Antarctic Treaty prohibits its extraction. The uneven distribution of gold deposits across the planet's surface is a function of ancient geology, volcanic activity, hydrothermal systems, the slow movement of tectonic plates over billions of years. Some regions were simply dealt a richer hand by planetary history. The Witwatersrand in South Africa. The Carlin Trend in Nevada. The goldfields of Western Australia. The rivers of Siberia. The ancient veins of the Nubian Desert. Each of these deposits represents a convergence of geological processes that occurred hundreds of millions of years before the first human being walked the earth. The gold was not put there for us. We arrived, we found it, and we built entire civilizations around its location. The civilizations changed the landscape. The gold, unchanged, waits in the rock for whatever comes next. The gold used in modern electronics is not ornamental. It is functional. Gold is one of the best electrical conductors known, it does not oxidize, and it maintains reliable contact even in extreme conditions. It is used in circuit board connectors, processor contacts, aerospace wiring, and medical implants. The quantity used in any single device is tiny, measured in milligrams, but across billions of devices, the cumulative quantity is significant. There is more gold per ton of discarded smartphones than in most gold ore currently being mined. E-waste recycling has become, for this reason, a genuinely significant source of gold recovery. The same metal that adorned the burial masks of Egyptian pharaohs and filled the treasuries of Spanish kings now sits in thin films on the contacts inside your phone. It is doing something new. But it is the same gold, still refusing to tarnish, still conducting light and energy with the same reliability it has always had. The practice of gilding, applying a thin layer of gold to a surface of cheaper material, is ancient, and its history illuminates the entire history of gold's symbolic power. Egyptian craftsmen were gilding wooden objects over 3,000 years ago. Roman artisans applied gold leaf to statues, furniture, and architectural elements. Medieval European churches were covered inside with gold leaf on carved wood and plaster, creating interiors of extraordinary luminosity designed to suggest the light of heaven. The gold leaf itself is almost unimaginably thin. A single gram of gold can be beaten into a sheet nearly a square meter in area. It is gold reduced to pure surface, pure appearance. And for most of the people who ever entered a gilded church or touched a gilded object, the appearance was sufficient. It looked like gold. It meant what gold meant. The thinness of the actual gold beneath the surface was irrelevant to the experience of the sacred. In ancient China, gold occupied a different position in the hierarchy of precious materials than it did in the Mediterranean world. Jade was considered the most noble substance associated with virtue, immortality, and heaven. Gold was valued, traded, and used in ritual contexts, but it did not carry the same metaphysical weight that it did in Egypt or later in Rome and Europe. Chinese bronze casting, not goldsmithing, was the prestige craft of the ancient period. Chinese coinage used bronze, not gold, for most of its history. The association of gold with supreme value and sacred power was not universal, it was a particular cultural construction that developed most intensely in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and later in Mesoamerica, and was spread globally by European colonial expansion. The assumption that gold is naturally the most valuable thing in the world is, in part, a European export. The Bank of England was founded in 1694 partly to manage the gold-backed financing of a war. William III needed money to fight Louis XIV of France, and a group of London merchants agreed to lend the government £1.2 million in exchange for a royal charter to establish a bank. The bank would hold gold reserves and issue notes backed by those reserves. This arrangement, private institution, public function, gold backing, became the template for central banking across the world. The Bank of England's gold vaults, deep beneath the streets of London, still hold gold today, including gold belonging to other countries' central banks. The vaults are protected by voice recognition locks, among other security measures. The gold inside has been there, some of it, for centuries. The institution built to manage it was born in a war debt, backed by a metal that was already ancient, and it outlasted the king, the war, and every other institution created in the same year. The phrase gold standard entered common usage as a metaphor for the highest possible benchmark of quality, the gold standard of evidence, of healthcare, of research. But its metaphorical use postdates its monetary use by a significant margin, and the monetary use itself was historically brief and arguably catastrophic. The gold standard as an economic system contributed to the deflation of the 1870s and 1880s, the agricultural distress that produced the American populist movement, and the depth of the Great Depression, because countries that stayed on gold could not expand their money supplies to fight economic collapse. When Franklin Roosevelt took the United States off the domestic gold standard in 1933, he was accused of destroying civilization. Within months, the American economy began to recover. The gold standard, the metaphorical gold standard of monetary policy, was abandoned precisely because it was making everything worse. The phrase outlived the practice and reversed its meaning almost entirely. Gold mining in the ancient world was extraordinarily brutal labor. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, described the Egyptian gold mines of Nubia in terms that read as almost unbearably grim. Workers, enslaved people, convicted criminals, prisoners of war were driven into narrow underground tunnels by overseers who did not speak their language. They worked by lamplight in spaces so cramped they could not stand. They were given no respite for illness or exhaustion. When they collapsed, they were left where they fell. Children carried ore out of the tunnels. The ore was crushed by older workers who were too weak to mine but not yet dead. Diodorus wrote that the workers envied the dead. This description dates to roughly 60 BCE, but the conditions he described had existed for 1,000 years before he wrote them and would continue for centuries after. The golden ornaments of the ancient world were not made from innocent material. They were made from suffering that was systematic, deliberate, and nearly invisible to the people who wore the finished objects. The gold rush that transformed Australia began not in the famous fields of Victoria but in New South Wales in 1851, when a man named Edward Hargreaves found gold near the town of Bathurst. Hargreaves had just returned from California, where he had noticed geological similarities between the American and Australian landscapes. He returned to Australia specifically to look for gold, which is itself unusual. Most gold rush discoveries were genuinely accidental. His find triggered a rush that within a decade had completely transformed Australian society. The population of the continent doubled. The character of the colonial settlements shifted from a convict labor economy toward a free labor, commercially ambitious one. The gold rush is often cited as the moment when the idea of Australia as a distinct, self-confident society rather than simply a distant British possession began to take shape. A metal found in a riverbed near a small town helped invent a national identity. Fort Knox, the United States Bullion Depository in Kentucky, was built in 1936 to hold the gold reserves of the United States government as they were consolidated from regional Federal Reserve banks. At its peak in 1941, Fort Knox held approximately 649 million ounces of gold, roughly 70% of all the gold held by central banks worldwide at the time. The building itself is designed as a layered security structure, blast-proof walls, multiple vault doors of different mechanical types, its own power plant and water supply, and a surrounding army base whose garrison is not tasked primarily with defending against foreign attack but against domestic theft. The last comprehensive audit of the gold in Fort Knox was conducted in the early 1950s. Periodic partial audits have been conducted since. The full contents have not been independently verified in decades. The secrecy is institutional. The gold, in all likelihood, is exactly where it is supposed to be. In all likelihood. The ratio of gold to silver in terms of value has fluctuated throughout history, but for most of the ancient world it was relatively stable at approximately 1 to 10 or 1 to 15. 1 unit of gold was worth 10 to 15 units of silver. The Romans fixed the ratio at 12 to 1. Medieval European kingdoms set it by law at various points. When the Spanish began importing massive quantities of American silver in the 16th century, the ratio shifted dramatically. Silver became more abundant and therefore less valuable relative to gold. The modern ratio has varied wildly, reaching over 90 to 1 at some points in the 20th century. This shifting ratio mattered enormously for trade between regions that used different metals as their primary monetary standard. A merchant who understood the ratio and who could move between a gold standard economy and a silver standard one could, in theory, profit simply from the gap. International currency arbitrage is not a modern invention. It was practiced by medieval merchants in the spice trade, moving gold and silver across the boundaries of empires that priced them differently. The word carat, used to describe the purity of gold, derives from the carob seed. In ancient Mediterranean markets, carob seeds were used as counterweights on small balance scales because of their relatively consistent weight. A gold object was weighed against carob seeds to determine its mass. Over time, carat became a unit not just of weight but of purity, with 24 carats representing pure gold and lower numbers representing alloys. The carob tree, a modest plant of the eastern Mediterranean, contributed its seeds to the measurement of gold purity and then disappeared from the story entirely, leaving only its name. 24-carat gold, the gold of royal jewelry and sacred objects, traces its name to a seed used on a market scale, by a merchant, in a world that has completely vanished. The gold of the Scythians, the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe who flourished roughly between 900 and 200 BCE, is some of the most technically accomplished and visually startling ancient metalwork ever discovered. The Scythians were not a civilization in the urban, monumental sense. They left no cities, no inscriptions, no lasting architecture. But they buried their dead in elaborate mounds called kurgans, and they buried them with gold, extraordinary gold, made in a style called the animal style, depicting predators in violent motion, locked in combat, caught mid-spring. The workmanship is so fine that some pieces could not be replicated by modern craftsmen using identical tools without years of practice. The Scythians traded, raided, and moved across thousands of miles of steppe. They absorbed gold from Greek colonies on the Black Sea coast and from Persian tribute and from their own raids. They made it into objects of savage beauty and took it into the earth with them. For most of history, nobody knew it was there. One of the most persistent myths about gold is that its color is inherent and unchanging. In fact, gold's famous yellow color is a quantum mechanical effect. Gold absorbs blue light and reflects red and yellow, which is a consequence of relativistic effects on its electron structure. Without these quantum effects, gold would be silver-colored, like most metals. The yellowness of gold is, in a sense, a product of physics that could only be explained in the 20th century. Every culture that venerated gold for its color, that saw in it the color of the sun or divine fire, was responding to a quantum effect that would not be understood for thousands of years after they had already built their theologies around it. The color that made empires was a consequence of how electrons behave when atoms are heavy enough that relativity applies to them. Inca gold was not mined in the European sense. The Inca did not have a monetary economy. Gold was sweat of the sun, a sacred material belonging to the Sapa Inca and the state. It was collected as tribute, worked by specialist craftsmen, and used to create objects for temples, palaces, and ritual use. The Garden of the Sun in Cusco, described by Spanish chroniclers, reportedly contained life-sized sculptures of plants, animals, and people, all made of gold and silver, arranged as if growing in actual soil. When Atahualpa was captured by Francisco Pizarro in 1532, he offered to fill a large room with gold to the height of his outstretched hand as ransom. The room measured roughly 22 feet by 17 feet. The gold arrived from across the empire, stripped from temples, melted down, carried by relays of runners over mountain roads. The Spanish melted it into ingots. The objects that were destroyed, the life-sized golden corn plants, the golden fountains, the sacred vessels, have no monetary equivalent. They were simply gone. The expression worth its weight in gold is, by modern standards, an almost comically modest compliment. Gold currently sells for roughly $60 per gram. A human being weighing 70 kilograms would, in gold, be worth approximately $4.2 million, a meaningful sum, but not incomprehensible. In the ancient world, by contrast, gold was far rarer relative to total wealth and population, and the same expression represented something genuinely staggering. In pharaonic Egypt, gold was so exclusively associated with the divine and the royal that its ownership by a private individual was, in some periods, essentially illegal. The expression has stayed in language long after the reality it described has shifted beyond recognition. We still say it, and we still understand it as meaning supremely valuable, because the association of gold with ultimate worth is older than language, older than the expression itself, and still running in us like a current from a source we have forgotten. Paper money was invented in China during the Tang dynasty, around the 7th century CE, as a solution to the inconvenience of carrying large quantities of copper coins. Merchants depositing coins with money changers received certificates of deposit, essentially receipts, that could be used in transactions. These certificates eventually became government-issued currency under the Song dynasty. When Marco Polo described Chinese paper money to European audiences in the 13th century, he was not believed. The idea that a piece of paper could represent gold or silver, that it could carry value by decree rather than by substance, seemed absurd. Europeans continued to carry metal coins for several more centuries. When paper money finally arrived in Europe, the backing by gold was considered essential. The paper meant nothing without the gold standing behind it. The distrust of paper and the trust in gold ran so deep that the transition took centuries and was never fully complete. The gold buried with Egyptian pharaohs was not simply a display of wealth. It was functional equipment for the afterlife. Egyptian theology held that the soul, or more precisely, several distinct spiritual components, continued to need material sustenance after death. The Ba, one of these components, needed to return to the body at night. The body needed to be preserved. The gold objects buried in tombs were not merely grave goods. They were the infrastructure of eternal survival. Amulets of gold protected specific body parts. Golden collars anchored the soul to the body. The golden masks on mummies allowed the Ba to recognize its host in the darkness of the tomb. When modern archaeologists describe tomb robbers as stealing gold, they are using an economic vocabulary that misses what the Egyptians understood themselves to be doing when they placed the gold there. They were not storing wealth. They were building a house for eternity. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1896 in the Yukon Territory of Canada was, in many respects, the last great gold rush of the 19th century type, vast, chaotic, and transformative. The gold was real but limited. The experience was brutal. Temperatures dropped below -50 degrees Celsius in winter. The mountain pass leading to the goldfields claimed hundreds of lives, and by the time most prospectors arrived, the best claims had already been staked. Of the roughly 100,000 people who set out for the Klondike, perhaps 30 to 40,000 actually arrived. Of those, fewer than half did any mining at all. Of those who mined, a small minority made their fortunes. The most durable fortunes from the Klondike were made, again, not by miners but by those who supplied them. Jack London was among the prospectors. He found almost no gold. He contracted scurvy. He went home and wrote about what he had seen, and the stories made him famous. The gold rush created literature out of failure. Gold has been found in seawater. The world's oceans contain an estimated 20 million tons of dissolved gold, enough, if it could be extracted, to give every person on Earth roughly 4 kilograms. The problem is concentration. Gold in seawater exists at roughly 13 parts per trillion. Extracting it would require processing volumes of water so enormous that the energy cost would vastly exceed the value of the gold recovered. Several schemes have been proposed over the centuries for extracting ocean gold. The most notable was a German attempt after World War I. Fritz Haber, the chemist who invented the nitrogen fixation process that fertilizes much of the world's food, spent years attempting to extract enough gold from seawater to pay Germany's war reparations. He failed. The gold is there. It simply refuses, at any practical cost, to be separated from the sea. The city of El Dorado, the Golden City, was a myth. But it grew from something real. The ceremony that gave rise to the legend was a Muisca ritual practiced in the highlands of what is now Colombia. A new chief, covered in gold dust, would float on a raft into a sacred lake and throw gold and emerald offerings into the water. Early Spanish accounts of this ceremony, the Gilded Man, El Hombre Dorado, were transformed over decades into rumors of an entire city of gold, somewhere inland, always just beyond the next expedition's reach. The earliest known gold jewelry in the Americas dates to roughly 2000 BCE in Peru. Andean goldsmiths developed techniques over the following millennia that were in some respects more sophisticated than anything being practiced in Europe or the Middle East at the same time. They mastered the process of depletion gilding, a method for enriching the gold content at the surface of an alloy object by selectively removing the base metals, leaving a surface that appears to be pure gold over an interior that is not. They developed soldering, casting, and repoussé techniques of extraordinary delicacy. None of this was transmitted to Europe before Columbus. The two goldsmithing traditions, Old World and New World, developed entirely independently over thousands of years and arrived, at first The term hallmark, used to describe an official mark stamped on precious metal objects to certify their purity, derives specifically from the Goldsmiths' Hall in London. The Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths, chartered in 1327, was given authority to test and mark gold and silver objects sold in England. Objects were brought to the hall, tested, and marked hallmarked before they could be legally sold. The system was designed to prevent fraud. Without the mark, a buyer had no official assurance of metal content. The London hallmarking system, with various modifications, is still in operation today. The hall still stands. Objects are still tested and marked. The institution is nearly 700 years old and still performing the same function it was created for, in roughly the same part of the city, using a word that is spread from London English into virtually every language on earth that trades in precious metals. The gold of the Temple of Solomon, as described in the Hebrew Bible, was staggering in its declared quantity. The text specifies that Solomon used 3,000 talents of gold in the temple's construction, an amount that, by various historical estimates, would represent something between 90 and 110 tons of gold. Whether these figures are historically accurate, symbolic, or exaggerated is disputed by scholars. But the literary function is clear: the temple was not just a building. It was an argument, made in gold, for the seriousness and permanence of the covenant between Israel and its God. The gold of the temple became one of the most charged symbols in three major world religions. Its loss, when the Babylonians destroyed the temple in 587 BCE, when the Romans looted and destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, was remembered not as financial loss but as sacred catastrophe. The gold was a presence. Its absence was a wound. The word treasury, meaning a place where valuables are kept, comes from the Greek thesauros, which originally meant a storehouse or a deposit. The connection between treasure, gold, and power was so fundamental to ancient politics that the treasury was often the most heavily guarded and symbolically significant building in a city. The Persian royal treasury at Persepolis held gold accumulated over generations of tribute, conquest, and taxation. When Alexander the Great captured it in 330 BCE, he reportedly found 120,000 silver talents and thousands of gold talents, enough that he required 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels to carry it away. The capture of Persepolis was not primarily a military event. It was a financial event. the transfer of the accumulated wealth of the Persian Empire into Macedonian hands, enabling Alexander to pay his armies and fund conquests that extended to the borders of India. The gold of Persepolis was the engine of the Hellenistic world. There is a technique in Japanese aesthetics called kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold lacquer, leaving the lines of the repair visible rather than concealing them. The philosophy behind it holds that breakage and repair are part of the history of an object, not something to be hidden. The gold seams make the repaired object more beautiful than the original, more interesting, more true. Kintsugi as a named practice dates to the 15th or 16th century, associated with Zen aesthetics and the tea ceremony. But the impulse behind it, the use of gold to honor damage rather than disguise it, runs counter to most of the world's traditions about gold, which use it to signal perfection, permanence, and the absence of flaw. In kintsugi, gold marks impermanence, survival, and the beauty of things that have been broken and have continued. The gold masks found at Mycenae, including the famous Mask of Agamemnon, discovered by Heinrich Schliemann in 1876, date to roughly 1550 to 1500 BCE, predating the historical Agamemnon by several centuries if he existed at all. Schliemann, consumed by his desire to prove that the Homeric epics described real events, immediately telegraphed that he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. He had not. He had found a burial mask of a Mycenaean king whose name is unknown, from a culture whose writing system was not deciphered until the 1950s. The mask is real. The gold is real. The workmanship is remarkable. But the story Schliemann projected onto it, the connection to Homer's heroes, was wish fulfillment, not archaeology. The name stuck anyway. The Mask of Agamemnon is still called that in museums and textbooks, carrying Schliemann's romantic error with it into the present. During the American Civil War, the United States government issued paper currency, greenbacks, that was not backed by gold. This was an emergency measure, necessitated by the cost of the war and the impossibility of maintaining gold convertibility. The result was inflation, prices rose, the value of the greenback relative to gold fell, and a speculative market developed in which people traded paper money against gold, betting on the outcome of battles. A Union victory would push the gold price down as confidence in the greenback rose. A Confederate victory would push gold up. Speculators therefore profited from Union defeats. On September 24, 1869, a group of speculators including Jay Gould and James Fisk attempted to corner the entire gold market, driving the price to a peak before the Treasury intervened and flooded the market with government gold. The resulting panic, Black Friday, ruined thousands of investors. The attempt to control gold had failed. But the idea of using gold as a speculative instrument, completely separate from its use in trade or industry, had arrived and would never entirely leave. The gold standard's collapse during the Great Depression reveals something counterintuitive about the relationship between gold and stability. Countries that abandoned the gold standard earliest, Britain in 1931, the United States in 1933, recovered from the Depression earliest. Countries that clung to gold longest suffered the longest and deepest depressions. The gold standard prevented governments from expanding the money supply to stimulate their economies, trapping them in a deflationary spiral. The economic historian Barry Eichengreen has argued that the gold standard was not the foundation of monetary stability it appeared to be, but rather the mechanism that transmitted and amplified the depression across the world. The very rigidity that made gold seem reliable, its fixed quantity, its resistance to political manipulation, made it catastrophically inflexible in a crisis. Stability and rigidity are not the same thing, and gold could not tell the difference. In ancient India, gold occupied a position in the religious and social fabric quite unlike its role in other ancient cultures. Gold was considered auspicious, a bringer of good fortune, associated with Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth and prosperity. The giving of gold jewelry at weddings was not merely a display of wealth. It was a ritual transfer of auspiciousness, a material blessing incorporated into the ceremony. Indian goldsmithing traditions stretching back over 3,000 years produced ornamental forms, specific types of necklaces, earrings, and bangles whose designs are still in use today. Indian temples accumulated gold through donation over centuries, and several temples in South India are believed to hold stores of gold that are among the largest in the world, accumulated over 1,000 years of continuous religious practice. The Padmanabhaswamy Temple in Tiruvananthapuram reportedly holds gold objects and coins whose value, when a fraction of the vaults were opened in 2011, was estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The vaults are not fully open. The full extent of what is in them is not known. The gold rush culture of the 19th century produced a mythology of self-reliance, individual fortune, and the transformative power of luck that became foundational to certain strands of American identity. The prospector, solitary, hopeful, equal in opportunity to any other man with a pan and a pickaxe, was a democratic image. What the mythology obscured was the degree to which successful gold extraction was almost never a solitary enterprise. The most productive mining operations from California to the Klondike required capital investment, mechanical equipment, organized labor, and access to water rights and legal infrastructure. Individual panners existed, but the real extraction of gold was corporate from a surprisingly early stage. The mythology of the lone prospector shaped American self-conception in ways that persist. The economic reality behind it was far more familiar. Capital concentrated in the hands of those who had it before the rush began. The Fatimid Caliphate, which ruled North Africa and much of the Middle East from the 10th through the 12th centuries CE, derived much of its political power from control of the trans-Saharan gold trade. West African gold, mined in the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, traveled north across the Sahara in camel caravans and arrived in the Mediterranean world through Fatimid-controlled ports. The Fatimid gold dinar was one of the most respected currencies in the medieval Mediterranean world, accepted from Spain to Persia. The gold that backed it came from a part of Africa that most of its users would never see or visit, traded across a desert crossing that killed a significant percentage of the caravans that attempted it, controlled by a series of African kingdoms whose wealth and sophistication were largely invisible to the European merchants who depended on their product. The medieval Mediterranean gold economy was underwritten by sub-Saharan Africa, and almost nobody in Europe knew it. The Mali Empire at its height in the 14th century was, by most historical estimates, the wealthiest political entity on earth. Its ruler, Mansa Musa, made a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 to 1325 with an entourage that contemporary accounts describe as including 60,000 men, 12,000 enslaved servants, and a caravan carrying 80 to 100 camels each loaded with gold dust. He distributed gold freely along his route through Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula. The effect on the Egyptian economy was severe. The sudden influx of gold caused significant inflation that persisted for over a decade. A single man's religious pilgrimage, conducted with the casual generosity of someone who had more gold than he could use, destabilized the currency of a major civilization. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage was so spectacular that it placed the Mali Empire on European maps that had never previously acknowledged sub-Saharan African kingdoms. The cartographers labeled the region with an image of a king holding a nugget of gold. The chemical symbol for gold, O, comes from the Latin aurum, but the etymology of aurum itself is debated. One theory connects it to a Proto-Indo-European root meaning to shine or to be yellow. Another connects it to the Hebrew or Semitic root for light. A third, less linguistically mainstream theory connects it to the name of the Roman goddess of dawn, Aurora. Whatever its origin, aurum contains within it the same association that appears in virtually every language that has a word for gold, an association with light, with the sun, with the dawn. The metal and the light were so consistently associated across cultures that the connection feels almost universal. Not because gold is physically luminous in the way that fire or stars are luminous, but because it catches light and holds it, giving back a warmth that seems to be its own rather than a reflection. Gold does not glow. It remembers. The first government bonds were partially backed by gold. The concept of a sovereign debt instrument, a government borrowing money from its citizens or foreign investors and promising repayment with interest, developed in medieval Italian city-states, particularly Venice and Genoa. The Venetian prestiti, government loans issued from the 13th century onward, were backed by the taxing power of the state and, implicitly, by the gold and silver reserves the state held. The development of sovereign debt markets was made possible by the existence of gold as a reserve asset, a guarantee of last resort. Without that underlying metal, the concept of a government promise to pay was too abstract to be credible. The entire apparatus of modern government finance, bonds, deficits, monetary policy, traces a direct line back to medieval Italian merchants deciding that a government's gold reserves made its paper promises worth holding. In ancient Rome, the wearing of gold rings was initially restricted to senators and equestrians, the two highest orders of Roman society. Gold rings were not simply jewelry. They were visible markers of legal and social status, worn in public as a declaration of rank. When the restrictions were loosened in later periods and eventually abandoned, the change was seen by some Roman commentators as a sign of social decay, of the erosion of the visible distinctions that had organized Roman society. The language sounds familiar, the complaint that precious things are losing their meaning because too many people have access to them. It is among the oldest social complaints associated with gold, and it recurs in virtually every culture that uses gold as a status marker. The anxiety is not about the gold. It is about the hierarchy the gold is supposed to enforce. The alluvial gold deposits of rivers, gold that has been eroded from primary deposits and carried downstream, settling in gravel beds, were the first gold that humans ever worked with, and they remain the simplest form of gold extraction available. A person with a pan, a river, and patience can find gold in any river that drains a gold-bearing geology. This simplicity is part of gold's significance. Unlike most mineral wealth, it is not the exclusive domain of industrial processes or capital-intensive mining. Individual prospectors can still find it. In parts of South America, West Africa, and Southeast Asia, artisanal and small-scale gold mining continues to be practiced by millions of people, using methods not radically different from those used 5,000 years ago. The panning technique, swirling water in a shallow dish to separate heavy gold particles from lighter sediment, is virtually unchanged. The rivers still carry the gold. The human hands working the pans have changed in every other way except how they move. The gold reserves held by central banks around the world amount to approximately 35,000 tons, roughly a fifth of all the gold ever mined. These reserves serve no function in modern monetary systems that requires them to be gold specifically. Since 1971, no major currency has been backed by or convertible to gold. Central banks hold gold not because they need it to back their currency, but because they believe other central banks believe it has value, and because the belief itself is self-sustaining. Gold's role in the modern financial system is almost entirely psychological. It is held as a hedge against uncertainty, as a store of value that exists outside any single government's control, as a kind of collective institutional memory of a time when it meant something specific and quantifiable. The gold sits in vaults doing nothing, worth nothing in any functional monetary sense, and yet the central banks hold it because they cannot quite bring themselves to believe that it is truly unnecessary. The historical overlap between gold and religion is so consistent across cultures and continents that it raises genuine questions about the direction of causation. Did gold become associated with the divine because it was already rare and valuable? Or did the association with the divine make it rare and valuable in the first place, concentrating it in temples and royal treasuries and making its general circulation taboo? The Aztecs did not use gold as money. The Egyptians used it sparingly and mostly for sacred purposes. The Asante kept it tied to royal and spiritual authority. The early Hebrews associated gold with the sanctuary of God. In each case, the sacredness of gold preceded its full monetization. It may be that gold became the ultimate monetary metal not primarily because of its physical properties, though those matter, but because it arrived in the monetary system preloaded with the most powerful form of social authority available, the sacred. Money backed by God beats money backed by a king. The technique of granulation, attaching tiny spheres of gold to a gold surface without solder, creating intricate textured patterns, was mastered by Etruscan goldsmiths in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE and has been a subject of fascination and frustration ever since. The technique was lost after the decline of the Etruscan culture and was not successfully rediscovered until the 20th century. For roughly 1500 years, craftsmen could see ancient Etruscan granulated jewelry in collections and could not understand how it was made. Modern analysis revealed that the Etruscans used a form of copper salt as a bonding agent, heated to the exact point where the copper diffuses away and leaves a gold bond. The precision required is extraordinary. The knowledge of how to do it, knowledge held in the hands and eyes of Etruscan craftsmen, was lost so completely that it took the combined resources of modern materials science to reconstruct it. The objects survived. The knowledge behind them did not. The Spanish word for gold is ouro, which comes from the Latin aurum. The Portuguese is auro. The French is or. The Italian is oro. All from the same Latin root. The Germanic languages English, German, Dutch use words derived from the Proto-Germanic gul, meaning yellow or shining. The Slavic languages mostly use words related to the concept of yellow as well. The Arabic dahab, used across the Islamic world, has a root meaning to go away or to depart, possibly referencing the way gold was always being taken elsewhere, always in motion as trade goods. Languages as a group tend to name gold after what it looks like, yellow, shining, dawn-colored, rather than after what it does or where it comes from. The material speaks before anything else. It speaks with its color. The Black Hills Gold Rush of 1874 began when a U.S. Army expedition led by George Custer confirmed the presence of gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota, land that had been guaranteed by treaty to the Lakota Sioux. The discovery created an immediate and irresolvable conflict between U.S. law and U.S. economic interest. The government attempted briefly to negotiate the purchase of the land. The Lakota refused. Miners entered illegally anyway, in numbers too large to stop. The Army, which had a legal obligation to keep miners out, instead cleared a path for them. The result was the Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877, culminating in the defeat and dispossession of the Lakota. The United States Supreme Court ruled in 1980 that the taking of the Black Hills had been illegal and awarded monetary compensation. The Lakota have refused the money, now worth over $1 billion, because they want the land, not its monetary equivalent. The gold is still there. The dispute is still there. The treaty is still there, in the archives, unresolved. The earliest gold coins did not have faces on them. The first coins of the Lydian electrum type were stamped with simple geometric designs, a lion's head, a geometric pattern that served as official marks of the issuing authority. Faces on coins, specifically the faces of living rulers, were a later development, attributed to Alexander the Great or to the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt who followed him. The innovation was significant. It tied the currency's authority to a specific, named individual rather than to an institution or abstract symbol. The face guaranteed the weight and purity of the gold. It also made the gold political in a new way, a piece of metal that literally bore the face of power. Roman emperors understood this completely. They used coin imagery as propaganda, and the circulation of coins bearing an emperor's face was a form of political presence in places where no other image of the emperor might ever arrive. The phrase "all that glitters is not gold" has a near-perfect inversion in the history of platinum. When Spanish conquistadors encountered platinum in South American riverbeds in the 16th century, they dismissed it as an inferior silver platina, little silver, because it did not shine with gold's warmth. They threw it back into rivers or used it fraudulently to adulterate gold and silver. For nearly 2 centuries, platinum was considered a nuisance metal. By the 19th century, it was recognized as rarer than gold and more chemically valuable for industrial and scientific applications. Today, platinum is used in catalytic converters, cancer treatments, and precision instruments. The conquistadors who threw it away were not ignorant. They were using the evaluative framework available to them, a framework built entirely around gold. In that framework, anything that was not gold was less than gold. The metal that did not shine like gold lay in rivers for 2 centuries, waiting for a different framework to arrive. Gold has been used in medicine for thousands of years, with varying degrees of scientific justification. Ancient Egyptian medical texts describe applications of gold to treat various conditions. In medieval Europe, gold was an ingredient in preparations called aurum potable, drinkable gold, believed to preserve youth, cure disease, and extend life. Alchemists pursued the medical properties of gold alongside their monetary interests. In the 20th century, gold compounds were discovered to have genuine anti-inflammatory properties and were used in the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, a therapeutic application that is still in limited use today. Gold nanoparticles are currently being investigated for use in cancer diagnostics and targeted drug delivery. The ancient intuition that gold had medical properties was not entirely wrong. It was simply pursued through frameworks, mystical, alchemical, that couldn't identify which properties were real and which were wishful. The gold in a modern cancer research laboratory and the gold in an alchemist's crucible are separated by a great distance. They began the same search. The gold standard created, for a brief period in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, something close to a genuinely global monetary system. A merchant in London, a manufacturer in New York, a trader in Shanghai, and a banker in Buenos Aires were all, in theory, operating in the same monetary world, one in which any currency could be converted to gold at a fixed rate, and therefore to any other currency at a predictable exchange rate. International trade operated on the assumption that this stability would persist. It was the closest the world had come, before or since, to a unified global currency. Its collapse during World War I, when every belligerent nation suspended gold convertibility to fund their war effort, was not simply a monetary event. It was the end of a particular kind of world, in which economic interdependence was supposed to make catastrophic warfare too expensive to contemplate. The gold standard did not prevent the war. The war destroyed the gold standard. The Dahomey Kingdom in West Africa, which flourished from the 17th through the 19th centuries in what is now Benin, developed a tradition of royal goldwork of extraordinary sophistication. Gold was used to make ceremonial objects, staffs, swords, umbrellas, thrones, that served as visible markers of royal power in public ceremonies. The forms were often figurative and narrative. Gold plaques depicted historical events, military victories, royal proverbs. The collection of Dahomey royal objects, most of which were taken by France during the military conquest of the kingdom in 1892, now sits primarily in the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris. The objects are considered among the masterpieces of West African art. The political negotiations over their repatriation have been ongoing for decades. The gold has traveled from the ceremonies of a kingdom to the locked cases of a museum, and the question of where it belongs, what institution, what tradition, what claim, remains genuinely unresolved. The Florentine gold coin called the florin, first minted in 1252, was one of the most important monetary instruments of the medieval world. Weighing 3.5 grams of nearly pure gold, it was the first coin in Western Europe since Roman times to have a stable, predictable gold content that did not fluctuate from issue to issue. Its stability made it the preferred currency of international trade across the Mediterranean and into Northern Europe. For roughly 2 centuries, it was the gold standard before the gold standard, a reliable, trusted instrument in a world of fluctuating, debased, locally variable coinage. The florin was minted by the Republic of Florence, a city whose wealth derived from the wool trade, banking, and textile manufacturing. The Republic was not large, not militarily powerful, not an empire. But its coin traveled everywhere, trusted everywhere, because it contained what it claimed to contain. For 200 years, a small Italian republic's reputation for honest money was as powerful as any army. Gold has been used as dental material for over 2,000 years. The Etruscans used gold wire to hold replacement teeth in place as early as the 7th century BCE. Roman dentistry used gold crowns on natural teeth. Throughout the medieval period and into the modern era, gold remained the material of choice for dental repair, not because it was luxurious, though it was, but because its inertness made it ideal for an oral environment. It did not corrode. It did not react with saliva. It did not cause the tissue reactions that many other metals provoke. A gold crown placed in a mouth in the Renaissance was, physically, not very different from one placed in the 20th century. The aesthetics have changed. White ceramic is now preferred, but the functionality of gold in dentistry was understood with great precision long before the chemistry that explained it. The mouth, like everything else, has been gold's laboratory for millennia. The ancient Silk Road was not primarily a road for silk. It was a network of trade routes along which a vast range of goods moved: spices, textiles, ceramics, glass, horses, and gold. Gold, in particular, flowed eastward from the Roman world toward China, which had a persistent demand for Western gold and a surplus of silk and other luxury goods. The trade imbalance worried Roman authorities. Gold was leaving the empire and not returning, draining the treasury. Pliny the Elder complained in the 1st century CE that India and China were absorbing Roman gold at an alarming rate, trading luxury goods for the empire's monetary base. The complaint was accurate. Roman gold coins have been found in India and China in quantities that confirm substantial eastward flow. The Roman Empire was losing gold to Asia in exchange for the luxuries that Roman consumers demanded. The trade deficit was real, the gold dream was real, and it could not be stopped. The Akan gold weights of West Africa, small brass figures used to measure gold dust in trade, produced from roughly the 15th through the 19th centuries, are among the most densely meaningful objects ever produced for a commercial purpose. Each weight had a specific value corresponding to a unit in the Akan measurement system. But each weight also had a figurative form: an animal, a human figure, a geometric pattern that encoded a proverb or a moral lesson. The object that measured the value of the gold being traded also told a story, delivered a teaching, referenced a body of shared cultural knowledge. Commerce and wisdom were literally the same instrument. The British Museum holds a significant collection of Akan gold weights. They are displayed as art objects. In the context of their creation, they were something more complex, tools of trade that were simultaneously tools of moral education. The market and the library were the same place. The discovery of gold in the Yukon and the subsequent Klondike Rush of 1896 to 1899 coincided almost exactly with the most intense period of the debate over the American gold standard, the political battle between those who wanted currency backed by gold alone and those who wanted it backed by silver as well, to inflate the money supply and relieve agricultural debt. William Jennings Bryan's famous Cross of Gold speech of 1896, delivered at the Democratic National Convention and among the most celebrated speeches in American political history, attacked the gold standard as an instrument of creditor interests against debtor farmers. Thousands of people were heading north to find gold while thousands of others were arguing about whether gold was the salvation or the crucifixion of the American working class. The metal was simultaneously a destination, an ideology, a metaphor, and a bone of violent political contention, all in the same year, in the same country, among the same people. All the gold ever mined in human history, from the first nugget picked up by a prehistoric hand to the most recent extraction from a South African deep mine, would fit, melted down, into a cube approximately 21 meters on each side. 21 meters. The length of a small house, the height of a modest building. In that cube sits everything: the treasuries of Egypt and Rome and Persia, the plunder of conquistadors, the dowries of queens, the coins of 1,000 kingdoms, the circuit boards of a billion phones. All of it, every troy ounce ever pulled from the earth over the entire span of human civilization, amounts to a box the size of a house. The earth has given up so little of it, and we have done so much with what little there is. The rarity is real. The desire is real. And the cube, small and golden and incomprehensible, sits somewhere in the imagination between a vault and an altar. There is a light in this story that does not go out. It has been burning for as long as human beings have been human beings, since the first pair of eyes looked down into a shallow stream and saw something that did not belong to the gray world of ordinary stone. Something warm. Something that held the color of afternoon even in shadow. Something that seemed, impossibly, to generate its own light. Gold did not make civilization. But it was present at every major turning point of civilization, and it was never merely a spectator. It funded the armies that built empires and the armies that ended them. It paid for the cathedrals and the wars that made the cathedrals necessary. It crossed deserts in camel caravans and oceans in galleon holds. It entered the mouths of the dead as a passport to eternity and the mouths of the living as a restoration of what time had broken. It was the color of the sun and the flesh of the gods and the soul of a nation and the ransom of a king. It was a reason to cross a continent, build a city, drain a lake, or die in a tunnel a mile underground. And it was, in the end, a lump of metal, chemically inert, physically soft, geologically unremarkable, that caught the light in a way that stopped a human heart. The history of gold is, in the end, a history of attention. Of what humans cannot stop looking at. Of what we reach for when we want to say, this matters. This is real. This is permanent. In a world where almost everything is temporary, everything is complicated, and almost nothing means exactly what it appears to mean, gold has functioned for 10,000 years as a kind of shorthand for certainty. Not because it is certain. The history of gold markets, gold standards, and gold rushes is littered with catastrophic uncertainty. But because it looks certain. Because it does not change when everything else changes. Because it was here before us and will be here long after us, still catching light in the same way, still warm to the touch, still unnamed in the great silence of the world before language arrived to name it. Whatever is in your hand tonight, a ring, a watch, a simple chain, it has been somewhere extraordinary. It has been in the earth for 1 billion years and in human hands for 10,000. It has been sacred, it has been currency, it has been a cause of war and an object of worship and a measure of love. It does not know any of this. It is simply metal, doing what metal does, which is to wait, and to hold light, and to endure. Sleep well.